The winter of 1943 pressed down on the European city like a heavy lid, sealing smoke and cold air inside its narrow streets. And when the late afternoon air raid ended, the sirens died into a strange quiet that always came after explosions. People emerged slowly from doorways and stairwells, stepping carefully around broken glass, bricks, and pieces of roof tile. Fire wagons clattered past with their bells ringing, and volunteers in thick coats shouted instructions toward the remaining pockets of smoke. In the square near the bakery, a wall had collapsed inward, and flour sacks lay torn open under rubble, turning the ground white beneath the soot. A woman sat on one of the fallen stones, coughing as dust rolled off her coat in little clouds that caught the sinking light. The bakery's front sign hung sideways by one hinge, and its painted letters swayed in the cold wind like a clock pendulum. She did not bleed, scream, or call for help. She simply sat and tried to breathe while firefighters and wardens moved around her to deal with louder emergencies. A rescue worker checked the bakery doorway for anyone trapped and then moved on without noticing the woman on the stones. A mother in a headscarf pushed past with her two small children, clutching blankets, heading toward the western block before curfew. The city no longer waited for instructions after raids. It moved like a machine, knowing that the real danger came not only from falling bombs, but from being outdoors after dark when patrol whistles began. The woman tried to stand, but her legs trembled, and she lowered herself back onto the cold rubble. She had been walking home with a small bag of groceries when the sirens began, and she had taken shelter behind a stone pillar at the corner of the bakery until the sound of airplanes faded. Now, the street was different, as if the raid had changed the rules of the city in only a few minutes. She watched as civilians in heavy coats headed toward printed signs that pointed to block shelters, church cellars, and government offices. Those with relatives or intact houses turned toward familiar roads. Those with ration tickets for the hostel walked toward the transport stop, hoping the motor carts had not been diverted. The woman had no place to go. Her street was further east and might not even exist anymore. The last time she had seen her building, it had been surrounded by scaffolding after a previous raid. Dust coated her hair, and ash marked her cheeks in streaks. Someone shouted from a rooftop that curfew would begin after the next siren, which meant she had less than an hour to find shelter, or risk being detained for her own safety. Children pointed at the smoking ruins of the bakery and asked if the bread had burned. Their mother pulled them along without answering, telling them to watch for loose bricks under their boots. A fireman opened a hydrant pipe and tested the pressure. Water sprayed sideways into the street, mixing with dust until it became gray mud that froze quickly at the edges. The woman stared at the puddles, her breath shaking from cold and shock. She did not cry or collapse. She simply stayed seated because she had nowhere else to stand. In peacetime, a person sitting by rubble might draw help, but in wartime, the rubble was everywhere and the living were forced to choose where to spend their strength. So they walked past her, not out of cruelty, but out of calculation, and the city moved toward nightfall with the quiet confidence of a place that had survived too many alarms already. The woman pushed her hand against the stone beside her, trying again to stand, but her knees shook and she sank back down. And now, the cold began to fight the shock in her body, in a slow and steady way that felt dangerous. People in winter cities sometimes froze, not because they wanted to stay still, but because stillness arrived before they realized it. A warden in a yellow armband shouted toward the intersection that civilians without homes must report to the district shelter before the second whistle, and a small group broke off toward the church steps, where a chalkboard listed which cellars were already full. From her seat on the rubble, the woman watched the chalkboard change as a clerk erased the words "South Cellar Open" and replaced them with "Full," using white chalk that left dust on his sleeves. He did not look toward her. His eyes scanned only crowds, signs, and capacity numbers. A boy with a bicycle stopped beside her for a moment, not to offer help, but to adjust his chain. And when he looked at her, He asked if she was going to the church shelter. She said she did not know, and the boy, already late for his family, pedaled away without speaking again. When she tried once more to stand, she managed to rise halfway and then steadied herself by holding a loose brick still warm from the earlier fire. Her coat smelled faintly of burnt flour and smoke. A cold breeze pushed through the street and lifted small papers into the air: ration coupons, grocery lists, and tiny pieces of cardboard that once held bread tokens. The woman watched as one token stuck to a wet stone and dissolved at the edges. She had come for bread earlier that afternoon. Now, the bakery had no roof, no loaves, and no reason to keep the chalkboard hours posted beside the door. The firefighters finished spraying the last burning sack and gave a short wave to the warden, signaling the area safe from flame. They did not check for civilians who were sitting, because the priority after a raid was to move the crowds off the streets before curfew and before the next warning siren that sometimes came without planes. As the workers packed their hoses, a loudspeaker mounted on a truck rolled through the square, announcing in a clear, simple voice that all civilians must be indoors or in registered shelters before the curfew whistle. The truck passed without slowing, its tires splashing through slush that turned dark under the wheels. The woman finally stepped down from the rubble with small, careful movements. But when she tried to walk toward the church shelter, a new problem arrived. The street between her and the church had been closed by a rope, and two soldiers directing civilians to the western side instead. She lifted her hand to ask, but the soldiers pointed without words toward the diverted route. The diversion added distance, and distance meant minutes she did not have. Her legs carried her only halfway across the square before fatigue dragged at her steps. A woman with a baby carriage passed, shaking her head and saying there was no room left at the church cellar and that the school basement might be closed because the last raid cracked the ceiling beams. The woman with the rubble dust on her coat did not know where the school basement was and could not have walked that far even if she had. Civilians without clear destinations became ghosts in wartime streets, visible but without claims. As a final signal that time was nearly gone, a distant whistle sounded from the direction of the clock tower. It was not the curfew whistle yet, but it was the one that came before, the one that meant move now or be caught. Civilians picked up their pace. Doors shut, window shutters closed. The bakery ruins stood open to the sky like a missing tooth in the row of buildings. The woman stayed in the square, not out of choice, but because she did not know which direction offered shelter and which direction offered a rest for being outside after dark. The city had instructions for the prepared. It had none for her. When the warning whistle echoed again, civilians near the square began to hurry toward doorways. But hurrying also created questions and comments built stories faster than any official bulletin. A woman with a shopping basket stopped at the edge of the rubble and asked another passerby if the lady sitting there was from the wrong side of the river. And the other woman shrugged and said she had heard that many people from the East Bank cooperated during the occupation, even if nobody truly knew what cooperation meant anymore. The word traveled 3 steps and reached a man who added that the woman on the rubble had been seen speaking to a foreign soldier earlier in the week, and by the time the rumor reached the ration line around the corner, it had grown into a full accusation. The burnt bakery had belonged to a family loyal to the resistance, so anyone sitting there must have been helping the other side. None of the people repeating these things actually knew who had owned the bakery or what the ownership meant. The story required no documents, only a target. When the woman tried to move toward the nearest shelter sign, 2 teenage boys stepped between her and the alley, not with threats, but with suspicion, asking her where she was from and why she was still outside after the diversion. Their voices worked more like barriers than their bodies. She told them she was trying to reach shelter before curfew, but they laughed nervously and said they did not want to be seen walking near someone who might be watched, because soldiers questioned people for less than that. When she asked if they knew another shelter route, they pointed toward the long way around the courthouse, knowing it would cost minutes she did not have. She walked anyway, because walking at least looked like compliance. Street by street, the city emptied into doorways and basements, and shutters closed against the cold. One man standing on a stoop shouted that she should not be outside at all, because the wardens would assume she was signaling someone. He did not say who, because the war had made enemies both specific and nameless. The woman held onto a fence post to keep her balance as the street dipped downward, and the ashes from the bakery rubbed into her sleeves, like a reminder she could not shake off. By the time she reached the courthouse corner, the larger crowd had already been processed into the school basement or turned away toward the church, and now a few soldiers stood near a truck, checking lists for people who had official billets. The woman raised her hand, hoping to ask if she could stay with the billet group until daylight, but before she could speak, another woman, warm coat, steady shoes, ration bag full, said loudly enough for the soldiers to hear, "Don't let her close. She was signaling during the raid. I saw her wave." It was not true, but it was confident, and confidence made the accusation sound like fact. The soldiers did not arrest the woman on the rubble, but they did motion her aside, not with violence but with bureaucracy. The side space was not a jail, but it was not shelter either. People who passed by whispered the word traitor quietly, as though the syllables themselves might cause trouble if spoken too loud. The woman looked at the snow forming thin patterns along the edge of her shoes and tried not to let her legs fold again. She did not shout back, did not argue, and did not try to tell a story that would correct theirs. Stories shouted in wartime rarely changed anything. They only cost breath. The crowd had the warmth of cellars and stairwells and blankets. She had the open air and the clock. A final noise confirmed her situation. The single, long curfew whistle rolled across the district, flattening all other sounds for several seconds. Doors closed firmly. Lantern glass rattled in their frames. Soldiers checked watches. Civilians in shelters sorted blankets. Anyone still on the street after that moment was no longer simply late. They were outside, and the difference between those two words mattered now more than any rumor the city had invented about her. A few seconds after the curfew whistle faded, a British officer stepped out from under the archway of the courthouse, coat collar turned up against the wind, clipboard tucked beneath his arm, the way soldiers carried things they did not want the weather to argue with. His boots clicked against the stones as he walked toward the truck, and at first, he paid no attention to the woman near the rubble, because his job was simple and urgent. Confirm that every civilian assigned to billets for the night was accounted for, and that no empty beds wasted space when the city needed shelter more than dignity. He read out a few names, received nods from wardens, and marked the clipboard with short, neat lines. When he looked up again to count the final group, that was when he noticed the woman standing by the courthouse corner, the half-balanced against the fence, trying to appear in place without truly belonging anywhere. Officers learned quickly how to read crowds, and what he saw did not match the noise that had reached his ears earlier. She did not look like someone signaling during a raid, nor did she look like someone who had a safe place to go, and her shoes told an even quieter story. The soles were wet from the bakery ruins, and the ash had darkened the stitching. People with homes did not have shoes like that by curfew. The officer asked the warden beside him if there were any more billet names expected. The warden shook his head and said, "All accounted for," meaning all the people on the list had already passed through the shelter doors. The officer nodded, satisfied with the numbers, but not with the picture in front of him. The numbers solved paperwork. Pictures solved people. He tilted his head, studying how the other civilians kept their distance from the woman in the rubble dust coat, how they lowered their voices not out of kindness, but out of fear of guilt by association. He asked one of the teenage boys why she was still outside. The boy muttered that she was trouble, and that someone had said she was from the wrong side. When the officer asked who had said that, the boy pointed to no one in particular, because the rumor did not have an owner. Rumors rarely did. The officer let out a slow breath that formed a small cloud in the cold air, and his jaw stiffened, not in anger, but in a quiet disappointment that wars taught faster than geography. He scanned the woman's coat again, then her hands, then the spot where snow had clung to her shoulder. His civilians who were truly signaling during raids rarely stayed in plain sight during curfew cleanup. They vanished before the first whistle. The officer did not yet walk toward her, but he removed his gloves and tucked them into his belt, a small sign that he had shifted from number checking to person reading. His eyes moved between the rubble, the truck, the closed cellar doors, and the woman who now leaned against the fence to keep her balance. The buildings around them creaked in the wind, shutters tapping against frames, and the square emptied of all civilians except the few soldiers and wardens finishing their last checks. In that quiet, the officer finally understood the real problem. The woman was not refusing shelter, nor breaking curfew with intent. She simply had no door that would open for her, and no rumor that would defend her. In wartime, that was more dangerous than being accused of anything. The British officer finally stepped away from the billet truck and walked toward the woman, not fast and not slow, but with a steady pace that told the wardens that he had decided something without asking their permission. Wardens controlled lists, but commissioned officers controlled decisions when curfew wrapped itself around a city. When he reached the fence, he stopped at arm's length so he would not startle her and asked a simple question. "Where are you meant to be tonight?" His voice was low and even, as if he were checking a ration number instead of speaking to someone the crowd had just pushed out of their shelter system. The woman swallowed before she answered, and when she did, her words came out small. "I do not have a billet. I thought the church cellar had space." The officer nodded once, taking in the information, then asked if anyone had directed her to the billet office earlier. She said no, not because she had forgotten, but because the raid had begun before she could queue for the ration depot's daily notices. And after the bakery burned, she simply followed the crowd until the crowd no longer wanted her beside them. The officer rubbed his thumb across the corner of his clipboard, an absent motion that meant he was recalculating the structure of the night. He asked if she had family in the city. She shook her head. He asked if she had papers that named a sponsor. Again, she shook her head. Civilians with no billet, no sponsor, and no family were the hardest category in any curfew city because they needed beds but carried no paperwork to claim them. He looked toward the billet truck and quietly asked the warden how many beds remained in the school cellar. The warden answered that the school cellar was closed because of cracked beams, and the church cellar was full. The only remaining spaces were in the courthouse basement, which was reserved for assigned billets and official transfers, meaning not for people the crowd had pushed out. The officer nodded again, and then asked a question that broke through the rumor like a broom through cold ashes. Why did the crowd avoid her? The warden looked uncomfortable and then said with a shrug, "Someone said she was from the wrong district." The officer turned his head slightly and asked, "Which district?" But no one could answer, not even the teenage boy who had spoken earlier. Rumor did not require answers, only confidence. The officer closed his clipboard loudly enough that the sound carried through the empty square, and that small noise cleared the last hesitation from his posture. He told the warden, "She's under curfew escort," using the exact phrase that converted a civilian from problem to responsibility. The warden blinked twice, then asked if the billets were allowed to receive new civilians after the final curfew whistle. The officer replied, "Under escort, yes." The rules were simple. Unescorted civilians, after curfew, could be detained, questioned, or left to wait for the morning lists. Civilians under escort would be placed where the escorting authority directed. The officer did not ask the woman if she agreed, because there was nothing else to agree to. Refusal would have left her in the square until daylight. But then daylight would have come after cold, after watch patrols, and after rumors wrote her into a role she did not own. He offered his arm, not to hold her, not to guide her, and not for romance, but because rubble made the street uneven, and she could fall if she walked unaided. She touched the officer's coat sleeve briefly for balance, then released it once her feet found the flat stones again. The warden shouted for the billet doors to be reopened for one extra entry, and a soldier ran to fetch the cellar key from the courthouse annex. The officer turned to the woman and said in simple language, "You're coming inside." It was not a promise, and it was not comfort. It was a decision. The courthouse basement was not designed for sleeping, but wars had a way of turning buildings into shelters without asking the buildings how they felt about it. When the soldier returned with the cellar key, he unlocked a heavy wooden door beside the stairwell and pushed it open just far enough to let the officer and the woman step through. A short corridor led downward, lit only by two dim bulbs that flickered from time to time as the generator behind the courthouse coughed into the cold night air. The officer walked ahead by half a pace, not to lead her, but to make sure the steps were clear. Loose plaster, dust, and broken tiles sometimes slid down the stairs after raids, and he did not want her to slip. When they reached the bottom of the stairs, a corporal with a ledger sat at a small desk beside a stove that offered only enough heat to keep fingers from numbness. The corporal lifted his head and opened his mouth to ask for a billet card, but before he could speak, the officer placed his clipboard on the desk and said, "Curfew escort, 1 civilian." The corporal paused, then nodded, and marked the ledger with a quick line across an empty row. He asked for her name, and the woman gave it quietly. He wrote it down without comment, without hesitation, and without looking for a district label to attach to it, because curfew escort erased those categories. After the name came the next question. "Any injuries?" The officer looked at her, and she shook her head, though her hands trembled slightly from cold and hunger. And the corporal wrote, "No visible injuries," because the rules required a note even when there was nothing to report. Then he pulled a small blanket from a crate and handed it across the desk. The blanket was thin, gray, and smelled faintly of chalk dust and wool, but it held warmth better than her coat alone. The corporal pointed toward the right side of the room, where several rows of camp beds had been set up earlier in the week. Some beds were already occupied by women and a few elderly men. Others held only folded coats, boots, and ration tins that marked ownership. A young warden guided the woman toward an open bed near the far wall. She sat down slowly, adjusting her coat beneath her, and placed the blanket across her lap while her breath returned to a normal rhythm. The officer spoke briefly with the corporal at the desk, confirming that she would be assigned for the night and that her name would appear on the morning list, so there would be no confusion at dawn about who had entered and under what conditions. The corporal made one last note in the ledger and set down his pencil with a small sigh that ended in the stove's weak glow. Once the paperwork was finished, there was a short pause in which no one spoke. In that quiet pause, the woman looked around the cellar and realized that the sound of rumor had finally disappeared. No one here whispered about districts. No one called her a traitor. No one asked why her coat smelled like burnt flour. The only sounds were the clicking of the stove door, the rustle of blankets, and the occasional cough from someone further down the row. The officer approached the woman's bunk just long enough to say, "You're listed for the night. The warden will guide you in the morning," and she nodded once to show she understood. He did not wait for thanks and did not expect any. In wartime, thanks was a luxury civilians did not always have time or breath to give. He turned toward the stairs, and as he climbed back up to the courtyard, the heavy cellar door closed behind him with a dull thud that sealed the night shelter from the cold square outside. In the cellar, warmth came not from heat alone but from order. Beds in rows, blankets folded neatly, and a ledger that recognized every person inside, not as rumor, but as names written in pencil. The woman sat quietly on her bunk, smoothing the blanket over her knees as other civilians around her settled for the night. An older woman across the aisle asked softly if she needed water, and when she nodded, the older woman poured from a canteen into a small enamel cup and passed it across without questions. Civilians in shelters rarely asked about past events. They asked only about needs. A warden came down the stairs, carrying a wooden crate filled with bread ends and biscuit tins from the courthouse kitchen. He stopped by each bed, handing out small portions. Nothing extravagant, just enough to keep hunger from keeping people awake. When he reached the woman, he placed a biscuit tin on her blanket and said, "Registered for the night," in the same tone he used for everyone else. The phrase landed stronger than any apology the crowd outside could have offered. Registered meant counted. Counted meant recognized. And recognized meant human. After she ate slowly, she glanced around and noticed how people in the cellar looked at her differently than they had in the square. There was no suspicion, no narrowing of eyes, no whispered explanations about districts or loyalties. The cellar had rules, and the first rule was that no one entered without being written into the ledger. Once written, rumor lost power. Later, the corporal from the desk came down the row with a small stack of billet tags, thin pieces of cardboard with printed numbers and handwritten names. He handed them out one by one, so that if the cellar needed to evacuate in the night, the wardens could account for who went where. When he reached her, he checked the ledger again before writing her name clearly in black ink on the tag. He clipped it to the blanket near her boots, and then nodded once in a plain, respectful way. The tag was not a medal or decoration. It did not erase the rubble or the bakery or the crowd. But it did something the crowd refused to do. It acknowledged her existence without accusation. The cellar stove burned low, and as the minutes passed, the noise above faded. Boots, shutters, and the last patrol wagons dissolved into distance. The woman shifted, pulling the blanket up toward her shoulders. She did not smile, laugh, or cry. Wartime civilians rarely performed their feelings that loudly. She simply inhaled slowly and allowed her body to accept the safety that paperwork and escort had provided. That quiet acceptance was dignity in its simplest form. Near the far wall, a small chalkboard listed morning procedures. It read, "Patrols end at 5:15. Billet release at 6 o'clock. Ration depot opens at 8 o'clock. The woman looked at the words as the warden dimmed the cellar lamps. The chalkboard made no mention of districts, rumors, or accusations. It only listed instructions for tomorrow. For the first time since the raid, tomorrow was not a punishment waiting to happen. It was a schedule she could follow. Near dawn, the cellar lights clicked on with a low hum, and the wardens walked between the rows of bunks, calling out in soft voices that the curfew window had ended and billet release would begin shortly. People sat up slowly, rubbing their faces, folding blankets, and reaching for their boots. The woman did the same, smoothing out the blanket before laying it across the end of the bunk, as she had seen the others do. A warden came by with a small wooden box containing billet tags, collecting them one at a time like a teacher gathering homework. When he reached her, he lifted the cardboard tag clipped to the blanket and checked the ledger to confirm her name, then marked a short line beside it to show she had stayed the night without incident. Afterward, he handed her a thin slip printed with simple instructions. Released from cellar at 6 o'clock, eligible for ration queue. It was not a pass to luxury or a guarantee of warmth. It was merely a place in the city's morning order, and morning order was a kind of safety. Civilians climbed the stairs slowly, blinking as cold air met their faces. Outside, the square looked calmer than it had the night before. Snow covered the rubble like a thin sheet, making sharp edges look harmless, even though they were not. The bakery ruin stood silent, smoke reduced to a faint smell that clung to the stones. Wardens swept the street, moving bricks into small piles so carts could pass. A few people glanced at the woman as she stepped out from the cellar door, but their eyes did not hold the suspicion from yesterday. but they simply saw another civilian released at dawn. At the courthouse archway, the British officer stood with his coat buttoned, checking a short list of newly released civilians before sending them toward the ration depot queue. When the woman approached, he nodded once, not as greeting, not as farewell, but as acknowledgement. She did not bow, salute, or thank him. She only met his eyes briefly, then looked away, as civilians often did when they had been granted dignity instead of favors. The officer pointed toward the depot and said, in the same plain tone he used for others, "You can queue there. They'll take your slip." She held the slip tighter in her glove and walked toward the depot, her steps more stable than they had been the night before. Behind her, the city bell rang once to mark the start of ration processing. The people shuffled into lines, clerks held clipboards. Steam rose from the soup kettles in the shelter courtyard. Life resumed, not as celebration, but as function. The war still stretched across maps far beyond the square. The bakery was still a shell. The cellar blankets were still thin. The curfew would return at nightfall. Nothing about the city had become gentle. But the label that strangers had thrown at the woman, traitor, outsider, wrong district, did not follow her to the ration queue. It stayed behind in the night, where rumors were loudest. In the daylight, she was simply a name on a ledger and a slip in a ration line, and that was enough. The war continued elsewhere, and people continued adjusting to it in quiet ways. For a civilian in winter, being counted without accusation was not triumph. It was survival with dignity. And in that city, dignity was as rare and necessary as bread.